They looked into my eyes at 10 years old and said my place was no longer in their family. Every resource belonged to the true heir, my newborn brother. Tossing a girl away was a perfect transaction to them. They never knew the child they discarded would become the only lifeline for their collapsing empire 20 years later. I am not coming back to save them. I am returning to extinguish their final hope. Hello to all our wonderful listeners at Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for tuning in today. We want to share that our channel was recently demonetized by YouTube, leaving us with no budget to continue operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to exclusive true revenge stories that are even more gripping and cannot be made public here, featuring emotional multi-voice performances. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the Patreon link in the description or pinned comment below. Now, let us begin today's story. Told through my own eyes. My name is Zara Paul, and this is how my journey began. I grew up on a grand, sprawling estate in Austin, Texas, a place where wealth was measured in vast acres of land and power was calculated by the sheer volume of a global logistics supply chain. My parents operated this massive, highly successful family business with an iron fist, earning a formidable reputation among the elite. To the outside world, we were the epitome of the American dream, a family blessed with pristine prestige and endless resources. But inside those towering stone walls and manicured gardens, the atmosphere was suffocatingly cold. My parents were consumed by a singular, toxic obsession that overshadowed everything else. They absolutely needed a son to inherit the family empire. I was their firstborn child, but to them, my birth was nothing more than a profound disappointment, a biological error that needed to be managed rather than celebrated. From as early as I can remember, I understood that my existence was viewed as a bad investment. I threw myself into my education, maintaining straight A grades, winning prestigious academic awards, and constantly trying to catch their eye or earn a sliver of genuine validation. I worked tirelessly, hoping that if I became smart enough, capable enough, and perfect enough, they would look at me and see a worthy successor to the family legacy. But every single one of my achievements was met with utter indifference. In the pragmatic, transactional world of the upper class, my parents viewed a daughter as a financial dead end. To them, money spent on my upbringing was capital wasted because, in their traditional eyes, a woman could never truly run a corporate empire or carry the family name forward. I became a ghost in my own home, tolerated out of duty but never truly wanted. Everything shifted irrevocably when I turned 10 years old. That was the year my mother finally gave birth to a baby boy. The atmosphere in our Texas mansion changed overnight from cold neglect to active, systematic exile. The long-awaited heir had finally arrived, and suddenly, my presence became entirely redundant, an awkward reminder of their previous failure to produce a male child. They did not raise their voices at me, and there was no physical abuse, because such dramatic outbursts would be considered unrefined and unseemly for people of their high social standing. Instead, their rejection was executed with the chilling, detached precision of a corporate downsizing. One freezing winter morning, I was called down to my father's cavernous, mahogany-lined study. Sitting across from my parents was a man in a sharp, bespoke suit, a high-priced family lawyer holding a thick stack of legal documents. There were no tears from my mother, no explanations from my father, and not a single word of comfort. With absolute legal coldness, my parents signed away their parental rights, transferring my legal guardianship to a distant maternal aunt whom I had never even heard of, let alone met. The justification they wrote into the official legal paperwork was as insulting as it was fraudulent. They formally claimed they lacked the necessary time and financial resources to care for 2 children simultaneously. It was a laughable excuse for multimillionaires, a polite lie designed to sanitize the fact that they were discarding their own flesh and blood simply because she was a girl. Within an hour, the paperwork was finalized, and my fate was sealed. I was instructed to go upstairs and retrieve my things immediately. I found 2 large suitcases waiting for me by my bedroom door, packed with a few articles of clothing and basic personal necessities. I was led outside into the biting of freezing winter air, where a black town car sat idling in the gravel driveway. My mother did not even come out to the porch to say goodbye, preferring to stay inside the warmth of the nursery with her precious newborn son. My father stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his expensive cashmere coat pockets. As the driver opened the back door for me, my father looked down at me with empty eyes and spoke the only words he would offer that day. He said, "Learn to take care of yourself, Zara. This family finally has someone to carry the torch." The heavy car door slammed shut with a dull thud, instantly cutting off the warmth of the life I had known. As the vehicle pulled down the long, winding driveway of the estate, leaving the only home I had ever known behind, I sat entirely alone in the spacious back seat. I looked out the frost-covered window, watching the grand house fade into the winter mist. I did not cry. Not a single tear fell down my cheeks, because even at 10 years old, I knew that crying was a sign of weakness that those heartless people did not deserve to witness. In that quiet, freezing moment, I made a solemn, unbreakable vow to myself. I promised that I would achieve success entirely on my own merits. I swore that I would eventually erase their last name from my memory, wipe away every trace of their existence from my life, and never, ever depend on a form of affection that had to be bought with a specific gender. They thought they had simply closed an unprofitable account. But they had no idea. They had just initiated their own ultimate destruction. The flight to Seattle felt like a journey to an entirely different universe, leaving behind the blazing sun of the South for the perpetual, comforting drizzle of the Pacific Northwest. When the modest sedan dropped me off, I did not find another sprawling, gated estate waiting to swallow me whole. Instead, I stood on the damp sidewalk before a weathered, single-story house nestled in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. The front door swung open to reveal Aunt Clara. She was a single, brilliantly eccentric woman who ran a small, independent materials research workshop straight out of her cluttered garage. Her home was an absolute chaotic marvel, a stark and vibrant contrast to the sterile, museum-like mansion I had just been exiled from. The living room was a dizzying labyrinth of towering stacks of blueprints, half-finished mechanical prototypes, and scattered metal parts. Clara did not care about pristine appearances or maintaining a flawless facade. She greeted me with a warm, grease-stained hand and a genuine, deeply lined smile that reached all the way to her eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated acceptance, something I had never experienced in my first 10 years of life. Living with Clara was a profound, daily revelation. In my previous existence, I was constantly suffocated by rigid, unspoken expectations of how a young lady of high social status should behave. I was trained to be demure, quiet, and perfectly poised at all times, an ornamental doll meant to be seen and never heard. Clara shattered those suffocating expectations completely and instantly. She never once asked me to lower my voice, to sit with my ankles crossed, or to act like a polite little lady. When my 11th birthday arrived, I half expected another formal, uncomfortable dress or a set of polite etiquette books, the kind of obligatory gifts my parents used to have their assistants buy for me. Instead, Clara walked into the kitchen, humming a cheerful tune, and handed me a heavy, grease-covered metal toolbox. Inside was a comprehensive, heavy-duty set of screwdrivers and wrenches. She looked at me, her eyes twinkling with a fierce, rebellious intelligence, and said, "Do not just look at the world from the outside. Zara, if you really want to understand how something works, you have to take it apart, dismantle the things you want to understand, figure out their secrets, and then build them back better." That simple, heavy gift was the master key that unlocked my entire existence. Clara taught me a fundamental truth that radically redefined the trajectory of my life. She sat me down one rainy evening amidst a sea of technical drawings and told me that my value was not determined by how other people judged me. My worth was absolutely not defined by the gender I was born with, nor by the wealth I stood to inherit. Your true value, she would say, pointing a wrench at me for emphasis, lies entirely in what you can build, what you can solve, and what you can create for your own life. Do not ever let anyone else write your code or design your future. She fiercely encouraged my boundless curiosity, turning her messy, cramped kitchen table into a sacred laboratory where I could experiment endlessly without the paralyzing fear of failure or the toxic pressure of aristocratic perfection. As the long, rainy years rolled by, the deep, agonizing wounds of my sudden abandonment began to heal, slowly but surely. The sharp trauma of being discarded by my own flesh and blood was gradually replaced by an all-consuming, fiery passion for data technology, algorithms, and computer systems. While other teenagers were busy navigating the trivial drama of high school cliques, I was diving deep into complex coding languages, dissecting network architectures, and building my own servers from scratch. I learned much later that Clara, despite her own highly unpredictable and modest income from the struggling materials workshop, was quietly funneling every single spare cent she had into my education and my passions. She pinched pennies relentlessly, skipped her own meals, and wore the same frayed, oversized sweaters for years just to afford the high-speed internet lines, the incredibly expensive advanced software licenses, and the upgraded hardware components I desperately needed to fuel my rapidly growing obsession with data analytics. It was during those quiet, late nights, illuminated only by the harsh glow of dual monitors, that the true, undeniable definition of family became crystal clear to me. Family was not about the people who happened to share my genetic sequence. It certainly was not the wealthy, heartless strangers in a distant state who had coldly signed legal documents to throw me away like a defective, unprofitable product. True family was the fiercely independent woman right beside me, the woman who would willingly stay awake until 3 a.m, her eyes bloodshot and her hands incredibly steady, soldering tiny, intricate wires, just to help me fix a burnt-out motherboard on a second-hand computer. Clara nurtured my brilliant mind and fiercely protected my fragile spirit, giving me the immense, unconditional support that my biological parents had callously deemed a massive waste of their precious resources. When I finally turned 18 years old, marking my transition into adulthood, I made a decision that was both deeply symbolic and entirely permanent. On my very first day as a legal adult, without telling a single soul, I walked straight into the local county courthouse and officially changed my last name. I proudly filed the heavy stack of legal paperwork to take Clara's surname, willingly and gratefully adopting the legacy of the remarkable woman who had truly raised me. It was not an act of fleeting teenage rebellion, but a deliberate, cold, and calculated erasure of my origins. By taking her name, I completely and utterly severed the final, invisible thread that tied me to that dark, miserable past in Texas. I was no longer a discarded daughter of a ruthless logistics empire. I was Zara, the proud daughter of Clara, armed with a brilliant, razor-sharp mind, a completely healed heart, and a relentless, unstoppable drive to conquer the digital world on my own terms. 18 years flew by like a relentless, high-speed stream of processing data. I was now 28 years old, firmly established as a lead systems security architect at the highly prestigious Vanguard Apex network. My daily life was a meticulously constructed fortress of advanced firewalls, complex encryption protocols, and silent, unwavering vigilance. I lived completely under the radar, enjoying a fierce and closely guarded independence. My days were spent hunting down digital vulnerabilities and thwarting cyber threats for a massive corporation, while my nights were wonderfully quiet, predictable, and utterly safe. I had built a perfect, impenetrable bubble around myself in Seattle, and Aunt Clara was the absolute only person allowed inside those walls. Then, without a single warning sign, the very core of my universe collapsed. Clara suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There was no prolonged illness, No agonizing time spent in a hospital ward, no chance for final, meaningful goodbyes, and absolutely no opportunity to brace myself for the devastating impact. One moment she was standing in her chaotic garage, arguing passionately with a local supplier over the phone about the tensile strength of a new alloy, and the next moment, she was simply gone from this earth. Her sudden death tore an astronomical, gaping void in my soul that felt entirely impossible to fill. For the first time since that freezing winter morning in Texas when I was a child, I felt profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The remarkable woman who had patiently glued my shattered pieces back together was gone, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence in her house that was absolutely deafening. I took an immediate leave of absence from Vanguard Apex Network. I spent my days wandering numbly through her cluttered workshop, running my fingers over the cold metal tools and scattered blueprints she had left behind, desperately trying to anchor myself in a world that suddenly felt entirely weightless and bleak. A few weeks after the quiet, private funeral, I received a formal legal summons to a boutique law firm in downtown Seattle for the official reading of her will. I walked into the sleek, glass-walled office fully expecting a brief, melancholic formality. I was absolutely certain I knew exactly what awaited me. I was mentally prepared to sign the necessary paperwork to take over her weathered, single-story house and the dusty, chaotic materials workshop attached to the garage. My only plan was to keep everything exactly as she had left it, preserving her chaotic laboratory as a private, untouched shrine to her brilliant, eccentric mind. I sat across from an older, sharply dressed attorney named Arthur, quietly waiting for him to hand me the deed to the modest property so I could go back home to mourn. Instead, Arthur placed a remarkably thick, heavy leather-bound portfolio on the polished mahogany table. He looked at me with a complex mixture of deep respect and sheer, undeniable awe. He folded his hands, leaned forward, and broke the silence. "Zara, I am not entirely sure how much your aunt shared with you regarding the specific nature of her recent research," he began, his voice measured and incredibly serious. But Clara was not just tinkering with random scrap metal in that garage. For the past decade, she was quietly, relentlessly perfecting a highly advanced, next-generation heat-resistant compound designed specifically for quantum microchip architecture. I stared at him, my mind racing to process the drastic shift in conversation. I knew she worked incredibly hard, but I always assumed her clients were local manufacturing plants, not anyone involved in cutting-edge, high-level silicon technology. Arthur carefully opened the heavy folder and slid a highly classified, heavily stamped patent document across the table toward me. Exactly 6 months ago, Clara successfully secured the exclusive, global core patent for this specific material. It elegantly solves a critical overheating bottleneck that has been crippling the entire tech industry for years. And just 2 weeks before her tragic passing, a massive, aggressive bidding war concluded among the top 3 global tech conglomerates for the absolute exclusive licensing rights to her creation. The air in the luxurious office suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. The rapid, pounding rhythm of my own heart echoed loudly in my ears. "What exactly are you telling me, Arthur?" I asked, my voice barely above a fractured whisper, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure. "I am telling you that the dusty, cluttered workshop you thought you were simply maintaining is actually the epicenter of a modern technological gold rush," Arthur replied, his eyes locked firmly onto mine. "The final acquisition papers and licensing agreements were legally executed just days ago. Clara explicitly designated you as the sole, undisputed beneficiary of her entire estate. You are not just inheriting a small house, Zara. You are officially inheriting the lucrative licensing royalties, the massive upfront cash buyout, and a highly significant block of preferred corporate stock. The total post-tax valuation of your immediate inheritance amounts to exactly $45 million. The words hit me with the overwhelming force of a physical blow. $45 million. I completely stopped breathing for several agonizing, surreal seconds. My brain, usually highly capable of processing millions of complex data points per second, completely and utterly flatlined. I was 28 years old, a girl who had been heartlessly discarded for being considered financially worthless, and in the span of a single, dizzying afternoon, I had been transformed into a phenomenally wealthy young millionaire. It was a staggering, almost incomprehensible new reality. Clara, the brilliant woman who practically lived in frayed sweaters and drove a rusty, unreliable sedan, had quietly orchestrated an absolute masterstroke of engineering and high finance. She had meticulously set it all up and placed it firmly in my hands so that I would never, ever have to depend on anyone else for the rest of my natural life. I signed the towering stacks of legal transfer documents in a complete, silent daze. I fully intended to keep this astronomical wealth entirely secret, to quietly continue my low-profile life at Vanguard Apex Network as if nothing monumental had changed. But in the ruthless, incredibly fast-paced world of high finance and corporate acquisitions, secrets of that immense magnitude are virtually impossible to contain. Within 48 hours, an anonymous, highly detailed tip leaked the specifics of the patent buyout to a few prominent West Coast financial news websites. They immediately ran flashy, clickbait headlines about a mysterious, highly secretive young female heiress stepping into a massive tech fortune overnight. They did not manage to publish my photograph, but they published more than enough digital breadcrumbs about the specific patent and Clara's unique background. I had absolutely no idea that this minor digital leak, a seemingly tiny ripple in the vast, noisy ocean of financial news, was about to act as a powerful homing beacon. It was a glaring, unmistakable signal that would inevitably reach the dark, incredibly greedy corners of Texas, instantly setting into motion a chain of explosive, high-stakes events that I had never, even in my wildest, most calculated algorithms, anticipated. Exactly 90 days after the financial articles regarding my sudden wealth went live on the internet, the quiet, carefully guarded sanctuary of my Seattle home was violently breached. It was a remarkably ordinary Thursday morning when the sharp, sudden chime of the doorbell shattered the comforting silence of the living room. I set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter, entirely unsuspecting, and walked over to pull open the heavy oak door. The breath instantly caught in my throat, freezing me precisely where I stood. Standing on my modest front porch, framed by the gray morning drizzle, were three ghosts from a past life I had deliberately buried. There was my father, his hair significantly grayer, but his posture still radiating that same arrogant, aristocratic stiffness I remembered so vividly. Beside him stood my mother, draped in an immaculately tailored designer coat, her face tightly pulled and artificially preserved by expensive cosmetic procedures. And slightly behind them, shifting his weight impatiently from foot to foot, was a tall, strikingly handsome 18-year-old boy I had never met in my entire life. I did not need an introduction to know exactly who he was. He possessed the exact same piercing, entitled eyes as the man standing next to him. He was the golden child, the perfect male heir for whom I had been so callously discarded 18 years ago. My first instinct was to slam the heavy door directly in their faces, engage the deadbolt, and immediately call the police to report a trespass. But the meticulously trained, data-driven side of my brain instantly took over, overriding my emotional shock and activating a cold, highly analytical observation mode. I stood silently in the doorway, letting the heavy, uncomfortable tension stretch out between us like a physical weight. My mother was the first to break the silence, instantly launching into a masterclass of theatrical performance. She suddenly let out a breathless, dramatic sob, lifting a perfectly manicured hand to cover her mouth as fake tears began to stream down her heavily powdered cheeks. "Oh, Zara," she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "My beautiful, beautiful girl, we have finally found you after all these years." She actually stepped forward and attempted to wrap her arms around my shoulders. I took one deliberate, freezing step backward, forcing her to awkwardly drop her arms and step back. Undeterred by my icy reception, my father smoothly stepped into the gap, adopting the gravely serious, deeply apologetic tone of a seasoned corporate negotiator trying to salvage a botched merger. "Please, Zara, just give us a chance to speak," he pleaded, his voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. "We know we made terrible, unforgivable mistakes when you were young. The business was in severe jeopardy back then. The immense financial pressure was absolutely crushing us, and we were completely overwhelmed. We truly thought leaving you with Clara was the only way to shield you from the complete financial collapse we were facing. It was a tragic miscalculation, a terrible error in judgment, and not a single day has passed that your mother and I have not felt the agonizing weight of that regret. We came all the way here because we want to make things right. We want to welcome our beloved daughter back for a proper family reunion." It was a stunningly flawless script, delivered with absolute conviction. If I had been an ordinary, desperate woman secretly yearning for the love of the parents who abandoned her, I might have fallen straight into their emotional trap. But my daily profession required me to look past shiny, deceptive interfaces and locate the hidden malware lurking underneath. The timing of their sudden, tearful arrival was entirely too convenient to be a coincidence. For 18 long years, they did not make a single phone call, send a single birthday letter, or make any attempt whatsoever to ensure I was even alive. Yet, exactly 3 months after a massive tech fortune was publicly linked to my adoptive family name, they miraculously found their moral compass and their paternal conscience. I did not chase them off the porch. Instead, I opened the door wider and politely invited them into the living room. I decided to play along, meticulously observing their behavior while offering them freshly brewed tea. The 18-year-old brother flopped lazily onto the sofa, completely unable to hide his deep boredom and subtle disgust at the modest, middle-class surroundings of my home. He tapped his expensive leather shoes against the floorboard, entirely disconnected from the tearful apologies his parents were desperately trying to sell me. I maintained a blank, cautiously optimistic expression, telling them I needed some time to process this massive shock, but agreeing to meet them for a formal dinner later in the week. The absolute second their luxury rental car disappeared down the wet street, the polite, confused daughter act vanished completely from my face. I immediately walked into my home office, locked the heavy door, and accessed a highly encrypted communication channel on my secure server. I reached out to an elite, highly secretive private financial intelligence firm based out of Washington. They were the kind of absolute professionals who specialized in conducting deep, invisible forensic audits on high-net-worth individuals, the exact people you called when you needed to completely unearth a global corporation's darkest secrets without triggering a single digital alarm. I authorized a massive, non-refundable retainer fee and gave them one very specific, uncompromising directive. I wanted a microscopic, unrelenting examination of every single financial transaction, corporate filing, and personal banking record associated with my parents' Texas estate over the past 5 years. Exactly 48 hours later, a heavily encrypted digital dossier arrived in my secure inbox. I sat alone in the dark, the harsh blue light of the dual monitors reflecting in my eyes as I slowly scrolled through the devastating, incredibly detailed forensic report. The truth was far more disgusting and pathetic than I could have ever calculated. The mighty, untouchable logistics empire that my parents had deemed me unworthy to inherit was currently bleeding out on the proverbial slaughterhouse floor. The golden boy, the flawless male heir sitting in my living room acting utterly bored, was an absolute parasite. The investigation revealed that as soon as he gained legal access to the corporate trust funds, he began recklessly funneling massive amounts of company capital into illegal, high-stakes underground casinos across the southern border. To cover his massive gambling losses, he had actively manipulated the corporate accounting books, committing blatant, undeniable wire fraud. The prestigious family supply chain was not just struggling with a temporary downturn, it was effectively dead. They were currently standing on the absolute precipice of a total, catastrophic bankruptcy, suffocating under a staggering, insurmountable debt of $30 million. The major banks were already preparing the legal paperwork to seize the estate. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting out a soft, incredibly bitter laugh that echoed off the quiet walls of the office. The puzzle pieces locked together with sickening, undeniable clarity. I was not the beloved, long-lost daughter, finally being welcomed back into the warm embrace of her family. I was simply the absolute last goldmine available on the map. They had read the financial news, calculated the massive value of my inherited patent, and immediately bought first-class plane tickets. They fully intended to use the fake promise of a tearful family reunion to manipulate me, hoping to systematically siphon my newly acquired wealth to completely bail out the miserable, criminal son they had chosen over me. They thought I was just a naive, desperate little girl who could be easily bought with fake tears and empty apologies. They were completely unaware that they had just walked willingly into the crosshairs of a highly calculated predator. And I was going to gladly watch them burn. I agreed to meet them for dinner at one of the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive dining establishments in the heart of downtown Seattle. I deliberately chose to wear a simple, slightly outdated gray dress, styling my hair in a severe, plain manner. I wanted to project the exact image they were eagerly hoping to see: a lonely, socially awkward data architect who was utterly desperate for a tiny scrap of family validation. When I stepped into the dimly lit, opulent private dining room, their reaction was a masterclass in theatrical deception. My mother practically leaped out of her plush velvet chair, her face contorted into a mask of overwhelming joy. She immediately ordered a rare vintage bottle of champagne that cost roughly $2,000, waving her diamond-ringed hand at the waiter with the dismissive arrogance of someone who believed wealth was an infinite, undeniable birthright. Throughout the extravagant appetizer courses, they aggressively bombarded me with fake nostalgia. They invented fond, heartwarming memories of my early childhood that absolutely never happened, painting a picture of a loving home that was a complete, fabricated lie. I played my role with flawless precision. I lowered my gaze, offered shy, hesitant smiles, and pretended to hang on every single word they spoke. By the time the main courses were cleared from the table, my father subtly adjusted his expensive silk tie, cleared his throat, and transitioned into the real reason for their visit. He put on his most comforting, paternal smile and casually mentioned that the Grand Family Logistics business was currently experiencing a few minor cash flow difficulties. He blamed it entirely on a temporary, unpredictable global shipping bottleneck and a few unfair market fluctuations. It was an incredibly smooth, well-rehearsed lie. He expertly framed their catastrophic financial ruin as a tiny, insignificant bump in the road, softly suggesting that it would be a beautiful, poetic opportunity for me to invest a small portion of my recent windfall into the proud family legacy. As the dessert plates arrived, my father slid a sleek, heavy leather folder across the pristine white linen tablecloth. Inside was a meticulously drafted investment contract. I slowly turned the thick pages, keeping my facial expression locked into a mask of naive, trusting curiosity. Meanwhile, my highly analytical mind was rapidly dissecting the lethal legal poison hidden deep within the text. The document was an absolute masterpiece of financial predation, stripped of its complex legal jargon. The terms explicitly dictated that my massive investment would not go directly into the main corporate accounts. Instead, the funds were to be funneled directly into a newly formed subsidiary holding company. Coincidentally, this specific entity was entirely controlled by my 18-year-old brother. Furthermore, the contract contained a deeply buried toxic clause granting them absolute discretionary power over the capital allocation. This effectively gave them the legal authorization to completely drain my bank accounts to pay off his staggering underground gambling debts, all without granting me a single share of equity, voting rights, or operational oversight. It was a perfectly constructed golden trap, designed to cleanly extract my millions and leave me with absolutely nothing but a worthless piece of paper. Sitting across the table, my brother sipped his sparkling water, a smug, entitled smirk playing on his lips. He fully believed I was foolish enough to sign my entire future away right then and there. Instead of tearing the predatory document to shreds and throwing my glass of water in their deceitful faces, I gently closed the leather folder. I looked directly into my father's eyes with wide, innocent sincerity. I told him that I was deeply moved and incredibly honored by the generous offer to finally rejoin the family business. However, I explained that my wealth management team enforced a strict mandatory legal review period of exactly 14 days for any financial transaction exceeding $1 million. I promised him, with a perfectly sweet smile, that the absolute second my lawyers gave the final approval, I would be entirely ready to sign the papers and transfer the funds. I caught a fleeting, microscopic flash of intense panic and annoyance in my father's eyes, but he quickly masked it with a warm, patronizing nod. They left the restaurant that night completely and utterly convinced that they had successfully manipulated their discarded daughter and secured their ultimate financial salvation. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. The very next morning, before the sun even rose over the Seattle skyline, I initiated a massive, relentless financial counteroffensive. I did not merely want to protect my $45 million inheritance. I wanted absolute, undeniable leverage over their entire existence. Using a significant portion of my liquid capital, I immediately hired an elite network of corporate attorneys to establish a complex, impenetrable labyrinth of anonymous shell companies. These completely untraceable corporate entities were registered in various offshore tax havens, completely masking my identity. Through these invisible corporate shields, I aggressively approached the three major national financial institutions that currently held the staggering $30 million of bad debt and defaulted commercial mortgages associated with my family's Texas estate. These massive banks were growing increasingly desperate to offload the toxic, non-performing loans from their balance sheets and were actively preparing the legal paperwork for a highly public, messy bankruptcy liquidation. My anonymous legal representative swooped in and offered them swift, incredibly clean cash buyouts for the entire debt portfolio at a strategically negotiated, heavily discounted rate. Because the massive transactions were executed entirely in liquid cash and processed through multiple shielded corporate layers, the banking executives eagerly signed over the exclusive debt rights without asking a single question. Over the course of precisely 2 weeks, while my parents sat comfortably in their grand mansion anxiously waiting for a naive daughter to send them a massive check, I was systematically purchasing the very ground they walked on. I bought the massive commercial mortgages on their sprawling shipping warehouses. I purchased the extensive, defaulted corporate lines of credit. I even bought the heavily leveraged secondary mortgage on their ancestral grand estate. By the time the 14th day finally arrived, the sweeping financial metamorphosis was completely and irrevocably finished, without a single person in the world knowing my true identity or realizing what had just transpired. Zara Paul had officially become the sole, undisputed primary creditor of the entire logistics empire. I now held the exclusive, legal power of life and death over the family legacy they cherished more than their own firstborn child. I owned their debts, I owned their property, and I owned their future. I sat alone in the quiet darkness of my home office, the final, legally binding transfer documents glowing brightly on my dual monitors. I reached for my keyboard and drafted a brief, highly professional email addressed directly to my father. I carefully avoided mentioning the staggering debt, the banks, or the shell companies. I simply wrote that my legal team had successfully concluded their extensive review process and that I was completely ready to proceed with the final financial agreements. I told him I wanted to make this a truly momentous, unforgettable occasion for all of us. I requested that we meet in person at the main executive boardroom of their corporate headquarters in Texas in exactly 48 hours to finalize the paperwork. I hit send. Leaning back in my ergonomic chair as a cold, satisfied smile crept across my face, the golden trap had indeed been set. But they were the ones who had blindly and willingly walked straight into the cage. The stage was finally prepared for the brutal, unforgiving final act. The private jet touched down in Austin, Texas, under a blistering afternoon sun. It was the exact same heavy, suffocating heat I remembered from my childhood, but this time, it did not intimidate me. I arrived at the towering glass and steel corporate headquarters of the family logistics empire exactly on time. I was escorted up to the top floor. Stepping into the massive panoramic executive boardroom, my parents and my brother were already waiting, their faces practically glowing with greedy, barely contained anticipation. A crystal ice bucket sat in the center of the massive mahogany table, chilling a bottle of champagne that likely cost more than a reliable car. Next to it lay a thick stack of investment contracts and a solid gold fountain pen, positioned perfectly for me to sign my financial independence away. "Zara, darling," my mother cooed, rushing forward with her arms outstretched, wearing a perfume so heavy it made the air taste bitter. "We are just so incredibly thrilled. Today marks the beautiful beginning of our family healing." My father stood tall, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket with a victorious, arrogant smirk. "We ordered your favorite vintage, Zara. After you sign these final partnership agreements, we will celebrate the rebirth of this company together." Even my brother, the golden heir, managed to sit up straight, offering a practiced, charming smile that hid his desperate need for my money to save him from his violent creditors. I did not accept my mother's embrace. I did not take the seat they offered. I simply stood at the head of the long table, the city skyline stretching out behind me, and placed my sleek leather briefcase onto the polished wood. The soft click of the metal latches echoing in the silent room sounded like the cocking of a loaded weapon. "There will be absolutely no champagne today," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "And I will not be signing any of those investment contracts." My father's triumphant smirk faltered instantly. He shot a quick, nervous glance at my mother. "Zara, please, we discussed this in Seattle. Your legal team had their 14 days. Everything is perfectly in order." "Oh, my legal team has been incredibly busy over the last 14 days, I replied, pulling a thick, heavy stack of legally bound documents from my briefcase and dropping them onto the table with a loud, resounding thud. "But they were not reviewing your predatory investment trap. They were executing my own acquisitions." I slid the top folder across the smooth surface directly into my father's hands. He frowned, putting on his reading glasses. I watched the exact second his arrogant reality shattered. All the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the papers rustled audibly in the quiet room. "What is this?" my mother demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. She leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the pages. "Arthur, what does this mean?" "It means," I stated calmly, projecting my voice so it commanded the entire room, "that your bank no longer holds the $30 million of bad debt your company owes. Your commercial lenders no longer hold the mortgages on your warehouses, and the secondary mortgage on your beloved ancestral family estate has also been completely transferred through a series of anonymous corporate entities. I personally purchased every single outstanding liability this family possesses. I am no longer your naive, discarded daughter. I am your sole, undisputed legal creditor. And this document right here is an immediate, legally binding notice of absolute default and asset foreclosure." A deafening, horrified silence descended upon the boardroom. My brother finally jumped up from his chair, his charming facade completely destroyed. "You cannot do this. This is our company. You are just a girl. You cannot just steal our entire legacy." "I am not stealing anything," I countered smoothly, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small, encrypted flash drive. I plugged it directly into the boardroom's central console. "I am simply cleaning up the massive criminal mess you created." I tapped the control panel, and the massive 80-inch presentation screen behind me roared to life. I did not show them financial projections. I displayed the cold, undeniable, microscopic truth. High-resolution images of forged accounting ledgers filled the screen. Then came the detailed, undeniable wire transfer receipts funneling millions of corporate dollars into illegal, high-stakes offshore gambling accounts. Finally, I projected a comprehensive, irrefutable digital trail of systematic money laundering, all bearing my brother's direct digital signatures and authorization codes. The golden boy stumbled backward, his back hitting the glass wall as he stared at his own undeniable guilt broadcasted in high definition. He looked like a terrified, pathetic child. "These are not just minor corporate infractions," I explained, my tone as clinical as a forensic pathologist dissecting a corpse. "This is felony wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. I had an elite private financial intelligence firm audit every single breath this company took over the last 5 years. These files contain more than enough irrefutable evidence to send your perfect, precious heir to a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades." My father collapsed into his leather executive chair, entirely defeated. The mighty patriarch of the logistics empire was reduced to a hyperventilating, broken man. He suddenly slid out of his chair, his knees hitting the carpeted floor as he looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. "Zara, I beg of you, take the company, take the warehouses, take everything we have, but please, do not destroy your brother. Do not hand that drive over to the authorities. We are your family." My mother fell to her knees right beside him, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "Please, Zara. Have mercy. We share the same blood. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood." I looked down at the 2 miserable people kneeling before me. I felt absolutely no pity, no guilt, and no sorrow. I felt only the incredibly pure, soaring liberation of a 20-year burden finally being lifted from my shoulders. "Your blood ties have been worth exactly $0 since the day I was 10 years old," I replied, my voice slicing through their pathetic weeping like a razor blade. "You threw me away into the freezing winter because you thought I was a worthless investment. You chose him. Now, you get to watch your perfect investment burn to the ground. Today, I am simply collecting a debt." I refused to entertain a single compromise or listen to another desperate plea. I turned my back on them, unplugged the flash drive, and walked out of the glass boardroom without a single backward glance, leaving them sobbing on the floor of their ruined empire. Within 24 hours, my legal team initiated the aggressive total liquidation of all their corporate and personal assets. Simultaneously, I handed the encrypted flash drive containing every single piece of financial evidence directly to the Federal Financial Crimes Investigation Unit. The family legacy was instantly obliterated, and their precious heir was immediately taken into federal custody without the option of bail. Exactly 3 months later, I stood under the brilliant, blazing Texas sun. The sprawling, arrogant mansion where I had experienced so much cold neglect had been completely bulldozed to the ground. In its place stood a massive, state-of-the-art architectural marvel made of glass, steel, and warm timber. I stood on the grand steps holding a pair of large ceremonial scissors. I smiled proudly, looking out at the crowd of supporters and local media as I cut the thick red ribbon to officially open the Clara Scholarship Foundation. It was a fully funded, cutting-edge technology and data education center dedicated entirely to providing free, world-class resources and housing for young girls who had been abandoned, neglected, or deemed worthless by their families. I took the very soil where I was once discarded and transformed it into a permanent, glowing beacon of hope, proving once and for all that a girl's true value is never determined by those who throw her away, but by the magnificent empire she builds from the ashes. Thank you so much to everyone for staying with me and listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are all listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story empowering and entertaining, please help us keep this community alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly exclusive true revenge stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the description box or the pinned comment. Stay strong, know your worth, and I will see you in the next story.